All right, so we're talking about benchmarks. We finally get to look at the performance of the Radeon 7 from AMD, not just to do a stupid unboxing. We're gonna look at performance, the numbers, the datas. Very exciting. We're gonna be stacking it up against the competition, which would be an RTX 2080 from NVIDIA, as well as a GTX 1080. I'm only testing these three cards, guys, mainly because the RTX 2080 and this card are about the same price at $699 US, and the GTX 1080 Ti, as most of us know, is on par or comparable in performance to an RTX 2080. So we're gonna be looking at all three just to get us a better idea of which one you should be spending your money on if you're in the market, that is, for a high-end graphics card. So without further ado, let's get started. So now that I have my brand agnostic jacket on, we can begin this review by talking about some of the essentials. World's first 7nm gaming GPU on Vega 20. Let's take a look at the specs and how it compares to the competition that we're testing today. You can see here we've got 3840 SPs, or streaming processors, on Radeon 7, as opposed to 2944 CUDA cores on the RTX 2080 Founders Edition and 3584 CUDA cores on the GTX 1080 Ti Founders Edition. Both the Radeon 7 and the RTX 2080 are maxing out at around 1800 megahertz for their boost/peak clock frequencies, but where the Radeon 7 really shines is with its memory, having 16 gigs of HBM2 compared to just half that, albeit of GDDR6 with the RTX 2080 Founders Edition. And even though it's an older card, the GTX 1080 Ti also has more memory than the RTX 2080, although it's GDDR5X, I should say, on a thinner bus of 352-bit with 484 gigabytes a second of memory bandwidth, as opposed to 448 gigabytes a second on the RTX 2080 and a whopping 1 terabyte a second on Radeon 7, with the help also of that 4096-bit bus. Woo! 300-watt TDP for the Radeon 7, which is quite a bit higher than the competition. And as I mentioned, we are seeing a $699 US price tag for the Radeon 7 and the RTX 2080 FE. The GTX 1080 Ti is in a weird spot right now because it's not quite in production anymore, and so you can't really find it for cheaper than around $850, and that's looking on Amazon and Newegg within the US. I wouldn't recommend anyone go out and pay that price, but again, we're comparing it to the other two cards today because it's comparable in performance to an RTX 2080, and I'm curious to see how it stacks up against the new Radeon 7. Here's a look at the testing hardware. You can see I used an open-air test bed with an Intel Core i9-9900K at 5 GHz. That's overclocked nicely on the Asus Prime Z390A with 16 gigs of G.Skill Sniper X DDR4 at 3400 speed. Now I want to talk about a couple things before we just jump into the benchmarks. The first thing is that I have heard through my little birds, through the grapevine, that some reviewers are having really bad behavioral issues with their Radeon 7 sample. I don't want to say any names, and I'm not going to speak to exactly what those issues have been. I can only speak on behalf of my own experiences, and we still don't know if this is just some bad samples that were sent out to press, or if these problems could pour out into the retail that consumers are buying. We don't know yet. Now, a lot of the benchmarks I use are maybe 2 or 3 minutes long, maybe 5 minutes at the most, which isn't really indicative of a real-world user experience. So I decided to actually pop this card in and game with it for longer than just a couple minutes. Starting with GTA 5 at 1440p, I played for about 30 to 40 minutes. And what I saw there was the temperatures getting quite a bit higher than I saw in any of my testing, because obviously we're putting a load on the card for a longer period of time. It was actually hitting up to 94C in hardware info. That being said, I also took a look at my clock speeds here and noticed a very nice tightly grouped clock speed range of anywhere from 1770 megahertz to 1820, which is right about where it should be. So there were no signs of thermal throttling or anything like that. And overall, and most importantly, I was seeing very smooth and stable gameplay with no issues whatsoever. And that was in GTA 5 again at 1440p. Switch gears to about half an hour in Resident Evil 2, the remake of course, at 4K. Decided to bump it up to that higher resolution to see how the card would perform. I was seeing very consistent clock speeds, this time in the 1760 to the 1800 megahertz range. Quite a bit lower than in GTA 5, not by a lot, but a little bit because of that higher temperature, of course. The clocks are ramping down a bit. So core clock and even memory clock frequencies were totally normal, but I did encounter a couple black screens and random lockups in the game. I would just be playing the game and all of a sudden it would go from full screen mode to windowed mode, and it would pause the game. Definitely shouldn't be happening, especially on a $700 graphics card. That being said, I'm currently testing this with a pre-launch press driver, and I'm really hoping that once public drivers get released that these sorts of issues go away completely, because it's just not acceptable on any new GPU regardless of the amount you're paying for it. If it does fix the issue, then great, we can move on, and if not, maybe we're looking at a bigger problem here that certainly requires further investigation. The next thing I want to address here is the ridiculous 16 gigabytes of memory on the Radeon 7. Do you need it? Is it required? Is it necessary for gaming? Can you even utilize 16 gigs in game? Well, previously, up until this point, I would have said no, because I personally had never experienced that much memory utilization in any game I had ever tested. But since then, I have changed my mind, because when testing Resident Evil 2 at 4K with maxed out settings, this sucker ate nearly 15 gigs of VRAM. And that was only after half an hour of gaming. This is the only game, this is the first and only game I've ever seen use anywhere close to that much memory. I think the second place is like GTA 5 at 4K with maxed out settings. That ate around 10 gigs. This is a good showcase for the Radeon 7 because it demonstrates that more games are starting to utilize more memory. That being said, I don't think there's an immediate mainstream need for 16 gigs of VRAM. I just don't. Unless you're part of that small slice of the gamer pie who wants to game at 4K on all the AAA games and max out everything across the board, no holds barred. For those users, the Radeon 7 does build a stronger case for having a ridiculous amount of VRAM. Finally, I ran 14 different gaming tests today, 2 of which were 3D Mark benchmarks, and then I also ran 6 AAA games at 2560 by 1440 and 3840 by 2160. Guys, without further ado, it is my pleasure and honor to present to you the benchmarks for AMD's new flagship GPU. Alright, so there you have the benchmarks. On top of this, I also added up all of the frames that were rendered across the board to put into a single chart that you see here so we can get an overall look of how these cards stacked up. So at 4K, the RTX 2080 performed 13% faster on average than the Radeon 7. Even the GTX 1080 Ti performed about 3% faster than the Radeon 7. At 1440p, we see a slightly larger performance gap between the cards, as to be expected at the lower resolution, with the RTX 2080 performing 16% faster than the Radeon 7, and the GTX 1080 Ti performing about 6.5% faster on average than the Radeon 7. So, with that said, let's draw some conclusions. Right off the bat, I would not recommend buying a new GTX 1080 Ti because even though it consistently outperforms a Radeon 7 in my tests, it's just not worth the $850 that it's currently being sold for on sites like Amazon and Newegg. Bearing that in mind, if you're comfortable buying used off of, say, eBay or something like that, then it's a great deal. You can find it for about $400 to $500 right now used, and the GTX 1080 Ti still pumps out tremendous performance years later here in 2019, so something to consider. Now, based on the data, if you're just looking for the maximum amount of gaming performance in terms of frame rates and 1% lows, I have to recommend the RTX 2080. You're simply getting more frames per dollar than you are with the Radeon 7. This is certainly true for 1440p gaming and 2160p gaming today. The reason I say today is because it probably won't be long before we start to see more and more titles that require more than 8 gigs of VRAM to run at 4K with maxed out settings. But at the end of the day, since the vast majority of existing titles hardly require that much memory, the 16 gig frame buffer is really not going to do you nearly as many favors, and in that case, you're just going to get more bang for your buck, more frames per dollar with an RTX 2080. The last little reminder here, guys, is that we only tested the gaming performance of this card today. So if you plan to be using it for anything beyond gaming, like ray tracing or 3D rendering, any kind of productivity workstation workload, make sure you look at other reviews who have tested in those areas to get a full picture as to whether or not this card is a good fit for your play and work needs. That's gonna do it for me, guys. Let me know what you think about Radeon 7 in the comments. Did it meet, exceed, or fall short of your expectations? Let me know down below. As always, guys, toss a like on the video if you enjoyed it. It helps me a lot, and get subscribed to the channel for more tech stuff coming at you real soon. Have a good one, guys. Thanks for watching. I will see you all in the next video.